Oh, hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I'm your host, that woman who could talk about the ancient world in literally any and every form, Liv. And that is particularly true in today's episode. I spoke with author and truly lovely human being, Elodie Harper, about her new book, The House with the Golden Door. So last year I spoke with Elodie about the first book in this series. It's called The Wolf Den, all about Amara and her life inside the Lupanar, the Wolf Den, the brothel in ancient Pompeii. And now I'm speaking with Elodie about the sequel, The House with the Golden Door. We talk about the book, but we also talk about just ancient Pompeii and life in the ancient world, particularly writing about enslaved people in the ancient world. The topic is tough, obviously, but Elodie has just such fascinating things to say about writing that world and what we do and don't know about that kind of life. And it's such an important topic, too, that's so rarely discussed. These books are really so great. I highly recommend them. But even if you haven't read either of them, you're going to appreciate this conversation for the ancient Rome of it all, the ancient Pompeii. And if you haven't looked into the artifacts and graffiti and mosaics that we have preserved from Pompeii through the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, I recommend you do some Googling because it's truly incredible. In these books, Elodie is looking at the complexities of life in that world, particularly through the eyes of someone who was enslaved, but as this new book opens, has been freed. What that looks like, how it changes you, how it doesn't change you, and just so much more. It's a great conversation, they're great books, and Elodie is just so lovely to talk to. I will always have her on to talk about this series and, I don't know, Pompeii, literally anything. Plus, I just love the book, so it is really quite nice for me. So let's get into the Pompeii of it all. Conversations, life outside the Wolf Den, ancient Pompeii and the House with the Golden Door, with Elodie Harper. Why don't we kind of start with so this is the second book in your series, which must have been so interesting to write. But it also reminded me, because it's been a year since I read Wolf Den now, how interesting and difficult it must be to write characters that are in a very real world and enslaved and dealing with covering enslavement. I'm going to start this out real heavy apparently, but dealing with writing enslavement in a way that you want it to be realistic and you want to express the horrors of it and not downplay that, but also make it enjoyable to read. So I'm so curious kind of how you go about dealing with that in your own head even.
That's such an interesting question, honestly. And that actually did preoccupy me in writing it. So I guess, the starting point in many ways is I just feel passionate about the representation of enslaved people from the ancient world, because I think that while we're all very aware of the horrors of slavery, there's a tendency to think, oh, well, it was a long time ago, so it wasn't as bad. People are enslaved in all the myths. It's no big deal in the myths. It's kind of just an accepted fact of life. And it's very rarely told from the enslaved person's point of view. And I think that's the crucial point. And so, kind of reading about the lives of enslaved people in the ancient world, specifically the ancient Roman world, there's some great books on this, like Robert Knapp's Invisible Romans. It's all about trying to go to sources that weren't written about enslaved people by elite male writers, which is where most of our information comes from, but kind of reading between the lines as to how they might have felt about their own lives. So I did find the research very fascinating. And you've got this whole preoccupation with family, basically, in like the epigraphs that people left if they were enslaved or if they'd been freed. There's like a much greater preoccupation with relationships. And I think this kind of feeds into the fact that when you're owned by somebody else, your relationships are so unstable. The only legally recognized relationship between an enslaved person and someone else was with their owner. So your wife, your children, your parents, none of these relationships had any legal status, which meant that you could all be ripped apart at any time. And of course, that's horrifying. But it's also interesting to me and kind of a testament to the human spirit and human dignity that people just put so much passion and dedication into overcoming this, and that these relationships were important to them, and that they went to great lengths to protect one another, to be together. I found that very moving and inspiring, actually. And there was a line that often played in my head from the writer Petronius's book, The Satyricon, in which a freed character says, I bought my wife out of slavery so that nobody could wipe their hands on her hair. And it's horrifying because you realize, people were just like props. They weren't even granted humanity, like somebody wiping their dirty hands on someone. But it's also a testament of love that this person bought the person they loved out of slavery. So although there's pain, a lot of pain in that one sentence, both the person who was being abused, the person who loved them witnessing the abuse, there's also a lot of defiance in that miniature story, in that sentence of, rescuing the person that you love, the pride that you felt in rescuing the person that you love. So I guess that's how I approached it, was that, yes, the conditions that people lived in were horrendous, but actually in writing about people's lives from that period, you're trying to return to them the humanity that they were themselves expressing and fighting for. So I felt strongly about that, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it is so important, like you were saying at the beginning too, just the idea of representation in that way, and we don't talk about it enough. It just becomes a sort of like, yes, ancient Greece and Rome, and certainly like sort of everywhere in the Mediterranean had slavery, but I do think it often gets left out or just sort of glossed over as just a fact of the time versus something that completely, ruled so many people's lives and dictated every single thing about their world.
Exactly. And there's a difference between sort of passing anachronistic judgments on that world for the fact that they had slavery, because obviously, unlike later forms of enslavement, there was no kind of mass emancipation movement. There was no sort of philosophical emancipation movement. So people didn't have access to that, way of thinking. But that doesn't mean that people were okay with it, or that they enjoyed being enslaved, or that it was okay. You can look at the past without applying anachronistic judgments of, well, they should have known better, or this, that, and the other. But at the same time, say, okay, this wasn't okay. And the people experiencing it on some level actually knew this. And I found that very interesting. And even sort of reading the writing of elite Romans who were free, they have this kind of visceral sense of horror that they would hate this to happen to them. It's much like the treatment of women, really, and sexual assault that I found in Roman writing. What I find more interesting is less that some writers just kind of accept this as like, well, this is just how things are, and they're quite lazy in their thinking about it. Like some more thoughtful writers are conscious of the horror. They're just pleased it's not happening to them. So I thought that was really interesting when I read ancient texts, actually.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I mean, it's something that comes up a lot for me on the podcast because, obviously I've sort of built this show on discussing these things and recognizing, sexual assault when it is sexual assault. And so often people, it less so now, thankfully, but certainly in the early days of the podcast, like my bad reviews are all like oh, we know that sexual assault is bad, but it was just there, so you don't have to comment on it every time. And it's like, yeah, we know it's bad, and they did too.
Exactly.
Yeah, the idea that they didn't is nonsense. It's just that the writers that we have tended not necessarily to actually like address it as a bad thing, but objectively we know that people back then would have recognized it as bad regardless, and regardless of whether it's a god or otherwise. They can recognize, lack of consent and just or the violence even inherent in sexual assault a lot of times. That's why I really enjoy reading. And I know people have sort of different opinions on how it comes across, and maybe it's the translations I read, but I really enjoy Ovid's Metamorphoses because he very often seems to like actually register that something is wrong.
I so agree with you about Ovid, and I nearly mentioned him with
Hmm.
this whole issue of sexual assault. I think he's a really key writer on this because sometimes it is titillating, and he's doing it for to make it sound sexy or whatever. But there is this great sense of unease, like his knowledge that this isn't nice, that this isn't enjoyable for the other person. He's really interesting in that way.
Yeah, he seems to actually recognize the horror involved, even though, I mean, obviously he's writing about it. He's writing typically like retold Greek myths with his own sort of slant on them. And but he's like the only source we really have that actually describes these events as horrific instead of just like a statement of something that happened. And I really appreciate specifically Metamorphoses for that, because I mean I haven't read a ton of his other except for some of the Ars Amatoria, which is something else entirely. But yeah, it's so interesting to have that reference point of like, okay, well, at least we know somebody was at least willing to write about it, and certainly so many people saw it that way. I'm sure most women also recognized it. We just don't necessarily have it surviving today, but that doesn't mean that they didn't feel it. So yeah, I think what you're doing by writing enslaved people in this way, because I think it's also really complex too. Amara is like not perfect. She is dealing with so much herself, and dealing with like also being free and living in that world and how that affects her comparatively to when she was enslaved, which also leads me to, I'm so fascinated by the intricacies of being free but not being free that are like examined in this book. So like, yeah, what were you thinking about that? Like, how much is it based in research? I'm imagining most of it. I mean, really anything about that.
So yeah, I mean, I think the status of freed men and women is really fascinating because we think of like manumission, oh yay, they're free. And of course the sort of really fundamental aspect, they are free. So they regain bodily integrity and they regain some social status, a significant amount of social status by that happening, and control over their own destiny to a much larger extent. However, there were all these kind of contractual and kind of traditional obligations that you as a freed person would then have to the person who freed you. So as a woman, you might have sexual obligations to the man that freed you if he did so for romantic reasons. If you were a freed man, working in the business, you would have to, still do a certain amount of work for your previous owner. You couldn't just go off and set up business on your own necessarily at all. You'd still retain some kind of financial dependence on them or some financial obligations towards them, all kinds of kind of social and other obligations. So there's, in that sense, you're not free. You're also inhabiting this kind of liminal state where you're neither fully free, like a freeborn person or somebody who's never been enslaved, nor are you enslaved. So it's a really interesting world. And it's interesting that freed people very rarely sort of seem to have married free people. They married other freed people. And there's kind of debate as to why that would be. But I also found like the laws on intimacy really fascinating from that time and kind of horrifying as well. So if you were enslaved and then you were freed, your partner, if they were still enslaved, would belong to somebody else. That's why you'd need to free them. And then your children that were born while you were both enslaved, they would belong to somebody else. So you'd need to free them. And if you were a free woman who had a relationship with an enslaved man, you know, there were all kinds of complications there as well, that you could, lose your status as a free woman. So these really kind of punitive laws that were in place. Of course, if you were a free man, you could sleep with literally anyone. Um, but yeah, so there were all these kind of nuances and hierarchies. And as you say, you could be freed, but not really free.
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess I just had never thought about it that much, because that was one of the things that kind of hit me most reading this, was like, wow, it I mean, it doesn't suck as much, obviously. It's not as horrific, but at the same time, like, it doesn't change your life as much as you would hope and imagine the idea of being freed would just change your life completely.
Absolutely. And what I also wanted to explore with Amara is like the complexity of the relationship between somebody who's freed and somebody that previously owned them. So with Felix, it's there's it's an extraordinary bond that people have between each other. I don't mean a bond as in a bond of affection, but it's a very profound connection that is forged, and particularly with an abusive relationship like Amara's and Felix's. So I also wanted to sort of think about how Amara might navigate that she's freed from her legal obligations to Felix. He doesn't own her, but she's not freed from the past of their relationship, or the power struggle, all these kind of things. And again with Rufus, her patron, in the wolf den, she very much sort of projects onto him what she wants to see of being her savior, that he's different from the others. It feels like love because she wants so desperately what he has to offer. But then when she gets to know him more as a person, and when she has a bit more status, how does he respond to that? Does he really enjoy that aspect of her gaining more power? Yeah, so in terms of just the sort of emotional and psychological dynamics of how that might all have worked, I found that interesting. And I think there is quite a lot in common of how abusive relationships in the modern world work as well, when there are sort of significant power imbalances or abuse that's taken place.
Yeah, I think the relationship between Felix and Victoria is such a perfect example of that, and the way people often just can't get out of abusive relationships, not
Yes.
for lack of really wanting to, but just for so many psychological reasons, and just the way that can really affect people, and in a way that's like not always a happy ending.
Absolutely, yeah. And then other people like Britannica, some people are able to have zero kind of connection and bonds. And so she was actually my favorite character to write. I love Britannica. And she's quite different from many of the other characters in what her goals, her priorities, her sense of herself is. So I wanted to explore that too, because there were also lots of enslaved people whose main feeling was hatred and resentment and defiance too. Who simply hated the people who owned them.
Mhm.
And people were murdered by their slaves. And enslaved people took revenge, and they were defiant, and they tried to escape. And so we sometimes, I think, as well, can slip into quite a romanticized view of enslavement, because some enslaved people did form very close bonds and emotional or even romantic attachments to the people who owned them, but many didn't as well.
Yeah, being able to look at the intricacies of all the different, possible relationships and outcomes is so interesting. I absolutely loved Britannica, and I'm very excited for the gladiator aspect.
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to give too many spoilers,
Mm.
yeah, I'm excited about that as well.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Yeah, it's just it's so interesting, and I think because I don't spend much of my time really ever thinking about Rome, I'm really drawn into this, just because Pompeii is so fascinating, because we have so much evidence that we wouldn't otherwise have, and so you get this this ability to have so much, I don't want to say daily life, but I guess just like the most utter normality that we would otherwise never know about because no one ever wrote it down. No one's like documenting the graffiti that's around their town and then having that work survive, 2000 years. We just got, I don't want to say got so lucky because the people of Pompeii did not get lucky, but like, looking back, like it's just so incredible the stuff that we do have from them just because of the the not so lucky volcano.
Yeah, I'd agree. And that's why it's so fun to write about that place, and just yeah, it's extraordinary the stuff that survives, the wheel ruts in the road where you can see where the carts have worn grooves, you can even see how the doors opened, that these sort of wooden doors that went right across the shop fronts because you've got the sliding grooves in the stone. Yeah, as you say, the graffiti, I find the graffiti wonderful as well because you hear the voices there. When I was saying earlier about not hearing enslaved voices, well, the graffiti's different. That's where you hear these voices. And one of my favorite sort of contrasting pairs of graffiti. So in the Wolf Den, I picked on a piece of graffiti in Pompeii that's quite horrifying, which is take hold of your slave girl whenever you want. It's your right to use her, which is just awful, and very kind of descriptive of what life was like if you're an enslaved woman. You had literally no agency whatsoever. So that's kind of something we kind of know about. But my favorite piece of graffiti in all of Pompeii is actually written by a slave girl who describes herself as a slave girl called Methe, the slave girl of Caminia, who, she talks about her love of Crestus and that she prays for Venus to look after them both and smile on their love and let them be happy. And it's such a sort of sweet and touching and romantic piece of graffiti that is completely at odds with the stuff that's written about enslaved people, that this is how she expressed herself. This is what she had to say, was about her love for another person. And it also shows she was literate, that she had something intelligent to write. I really enjoy that aspect of the graffiti. And if it weren't for Pompeii, we'd never have these messages. And yeah, and all the other stuff that I put into the books of like the mosaics, the paintings, you can go to the museum and see all these incredibly beautiful artifacts as well.
I've still never been to Pompeii. I'm so mad about it.
You need to go.
No. Yeah. Well, and what you were saying too about just even calling out to the gods and things is always something that interests me, obviously. And I think that that's another kind of daily life thing that is sometimes lost because of just time and the things that do get preserved, and then we do have it in Pompeii. And so that's sort of leads to the other thing that I was really interesting about this book is just the way you broke it up through time based on the celebrations and things. And so I'm curious kind of what your reasoning was for that. Or, I mean, I lean towards just like, wanting to talk about all the different like celebrations and things that take place. So yeah, what were you thinking there?
Well, to be honest, that was part of it as well, just because they're so much fun to write about and reimagine. And also, I wanted to sort of show the passage of time in a way that felt rooted in the ancient world. And, I probably, if anything, toned back on the religious aspect because it is quite alien for us. And if you overstuff it, it can be too much. It can sort of bog the narrative down too much with explanation. But I feel like the festivals is something that we can kind of get a handle on and a way in as to just how much their lives were influenced by sort of thoughts about the gods and the seasons, and the unpredictability of life, and very different attitudes. So probably my favorite festival that I write about is one called the Lemuria, which is in May, which is to appease the dark spirits, people who've been murdered or unburied, or the angry spirits who might come back to haunt the living. And Ovid has a very detailed description of this festival in his Fasti of the whole household getting together and making a huge amount of noise to sort of scare the spirits away at midnight, and the sort of leader of the household doing this kind of recital and throwing the black beans over his shoulder that the spirits will then take. They'll be distracted, they'll take the beans. And just the whole idea of like whole streets in Pompeii in the dark at midnight performing this ritual, I just found it very evocative, and I wanted to write about it. And it takes place at quite a sort of pivotal moment for Amara when she's, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but she's embarking on a relationship that could threaten a lot of things about her life, but it's also a way of her. The way I wanted to write that relationship, it's not a kind of straightforward romantic relationship. This is also about two people with very limited choices, their desire for freedom, not just their desire for each other, and their desire to make a connection that is theirs. So it's as much about wanting to belong, wanting to have family, as it is a kind of romance, if you like, which, as from what we were talking about before, that sort of enslaved people and freed people had far fewer choices about who they could have as their family. So yeah, and that festival I enjoyed writing, and then other ones which are just, just much more fun, like the Nemoria, which was a festival for women, and that they would take torches and visit this grove, and that this would be a fun time for them where they got some liberty. I find that really interesting about Roman festivals as well. It's often a time when the underdog gets to have a day off or be celebrated. So you've got festivals for sex workers, for enslaved, so festivals for sex workers like the Floralia or the Vinalia, for women like the Nemoria, and enslaved people too got a holiday then. And then on the Saturnalia, which is for enslaved people. So that's quite an interesting aspect of Roman culture as well, I think, that it wasn't like wall-to-wall oppression. There were like these pressure points when people who normally had very few choices were able to have some time off from the sort of tough lives that they led. And so I guess that's also why I punctuated it with festivals, because these were points at which maybe anything could happen, things out of the ordinary could happen.
And it's interesting because you've also set up this whole relationship, between Amara, who is recently freed but not entirely free, but then she's also interacting with the women from her old life, both free and not entirely free, or rather not at all free. And it was really interesting to see the ways you could then use those moments to have them interact in a different way, because obviously she has to act a certain way as both like a freed woman and a woman who is a patron of this, fancy guy, and all those different ways in which, like,
and as a slave owner. And I thought it was really, really important to show that. And it's a really dark moment in Amara's story when and why she decides that she needs to own other people. I mean, I don't want to give too many spoilers. Like, one of her decisions to own somebody is not such a dark one, but ultimately she makes a very commercial choice to use people as a means of gaining profit. And I felt it was important to put that in, although it does complicate the reader's relationship with Amara, because that was very much what happened in the ancient world. And freed people did then go on to own other people. And I didn't want to give her, although I made her have a lot of guilt and angst around it, as I think would have been realistic, I didn't want to give her anachronistic views of, I can't do this, this is so terrible, because people did do this. So I wanted her to feel uncomfortable about it, and to sort of explore some of that emotion. But yes, it is that was probably the darkest scene to write, when she makes that decision.
well, and I think it does make her and the whole story more real to look at the darker sides of it, because I mean, obviously writing a novel is all about the person writing it, but I really appreciate the idea of looking at the reality of it, and seeing that, she still has to exist in that world, even as somebody who's been freed herself. Like, she can't just like completely remove herself from a society that bases so much of itself on enslaving people. You can't just decide that you're not going to you're not going to partake in it at all because it's just not how it worked.
Yes, absolutely. And people didn't have access necessarily to the belief system to understand how it was wrong. The most enlightened people got was about being humane. And, but so what? Ultimately, of course, better to be humane than cruel, but it's still wrong to own people. So yeah, and I thought it was important not to romanticize Amara's relationship with those new people she brings into her life who she owns. She is smart enough to understand that they can't be friends, that they might have been friends in another context, but not in this one.
And she can choose to be, as kind as possible in the situation, but still, the situation is how it is. And so there's only so much that one can do.
Yeah, she's exploiting people, and she knows she's exploiting people.
Hmm.
And she tries to do it without cruelty, but ultimately that's what she's doing.
It's almost more interesting just to have her be so aware of it too, without, yeah, I don't know. It's just generally, yeah, it's fascinating to think about the ancient world and just how normal it was to own people, and the context too, because it was typically like due to war, or just poverty, and all those different reasons why people would end up enslaved. It is sort of fascinating in itself, and I think it also, it provides a lot of the sort of the reasoning for why people didn't have the ability to just look at it and say, no, it's 100% wrong to own people, because it was just such a normal thing, and it was based in these things that they could see the why. It was like, well, we had no money, we had to sell you, or like your
Exactly.
city got taken and burned, and so yeah, it just, this is the way it was.
Bad luck, basically.
Mm.
I think that's a really interesting and quite different aspect to ancient slavery, to say, the transatlantic slave trade, where they really tried to use some kind of moral justification for it and a racist basis for it, that certain types of people, deserve to be enslaved, which is actually much more repugnant than the ancient. I mean, all forms of slavery are repugnant. I'm not trying to say that Roman slavery was okay, but there was an element of this could happen to anyone. This is about bad luck, ultimately. This isn't because one group of people are inherently, deserve to be enslaved by another group of people. So I think you're absolutely right that this is perhaps also why they didn't challenge it as much, because it was kind of a fact of life that could happen to almost anyone. Yes, as a freeborn Roman citizen, it wasn't meant to happen, but it still could. Even if you were a freeborn Roman citizen and you fell on really really hard times, or you were a prisoner of war or whatever, it could happen to you. So yeah, I guess people were much closer to it.
Oh, and even just writing about it, you have a good 2,000 years of disconnect, and
Yes.
I obviously that's going to make it a lot easier, but it is, yeah, it is ultimately, it feel, it, like, you were trying to figure out the best way to phrase that, because obviously, yes, like all forms of enslavement are bad, but you can see the difference when it's just like a something that your entire society is based on, and is based on luck, and just like shit happening, versus this like deep rooted racist ideas is.
Yes, exactly. And a racist ideology driving it, rather than, as you say, something that happened to people of all nationalities and colors and creeds.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the thing I try to remind my listeners all the time, is they were all very bad to other people, but it just wasn't based in explicit, skin color racism. In
Yeah.
ancient Greece, it's a lot about what language you spoke, not necessarily for enslavement, but certainly if you spoke Greek, you were less likely to have the issues. So it's just, yeah, it's interesting to look at.
It's almost more like xenophobia than racism. So
Hmm.
it's a kind of prejudice against people because of where they're from, rather than kind of who they are type thing.
Yeah, just so different from the world we live in now. you know yeah, it's just, it's an interesting thing to look back on, and I think important to point out that, I mean, I think a lot of people romanticize Greece and Rome, but Rome for different reasons. I think more so the war aspect, which gets a little bit different type of romanticization. But Greece, it's like, I think it's often forgot entirely that they also worked on entirely like on an enslaved as an enslaved culture, and just these darker aspects of them that I think often get forgotten in favor of the pretty sparkling marble buildings and everything.
Yeah, and and that's part of it too. And it's that's why I really enjoyed writing. I did enjoy getting out of the absolute darkness of the brothel. I can't lie. Like, I could not have set a whole trilogy in the Lupana. I really felt passionate about writing that book, and I hope there's a lot of hope and inspiration in it as well. But it was quite a dark place to be writing a book. So there's a lot more of the kind of sparkling buildings and the lightness and the parties and the artwork in this book, particularly the interlude at Pliny's place in Misenum. So we get to see that side of Roman life, but I did always want to be tied to whose eyes you're seeing it through, through a woman's eyes, through enslaved people's eyes, or, at most through freed people's lives. So, Amara's got a foot in both camps in this book. Enslavement because of her past and also because of the people she loves, and the free world because of her new status as a freed woman, and also the people whose patronage she needs to attract. Actually, one of my favorite characters to write, Julia Felix, is a real person from Pompeii. And it was interesting to write a woman like that. So she was a very powerful businesswoman in the town. She was illegitimate. She was clearly a force to be reckoned with. It's one of the only public roads that got closed off for a private building is hers. So, I had some male characters kind of peeved about this, that she'd managed to get this through. And she ran this kind of baths complex and apartments that she rented, luxury sort of site. And I thought she would be somebody that Amara would admire. And in this story, Amara befriends. But that was interesting too, sort of thinking about, okay, so she was an illegitimate woman. There's no mention of a husband in the inscription that we've got. She's the sole owner of this sort of commercial complex, and she obviously ran it pretty successfully.
I was just going to lead the conversation into talking about the various women that you have in this book, because I think it is so interesting to look at them and all the different ways that a woman could kind of exist in that world, both like with a patron, with a husband, or rather, there's not much in the way of husbands with these characters, but just I'm going to forget the other one's name now, but Julia specifically was so interesting. But then the woman the courtesan woman.
Drusilla. Yes. So, yeah, I loved writing Drusilla. And, Drusilla's from Ethiopia, so she was foreign to Pompeii, and she, like Amara, was enslaved. But unlike Amara, she's independently wealthy now. She's a freed woman who's independently wealthy. Her patron is dead. And set her up. So she's, because with courtesans, there is this kind of hierarchy of the ones who have managed to, very rare, the Drusillas were pretty unusual, who've managed to amass some wealth that they do actually have more power to pick and choose who their lovers are, who their patrons are. It's not that they would just like pick some guy who wasn't rich, so they're still guided by that, but I guess slightly more in common with modern relationship dynamics. And in many ways, kind of Drusilla, the courtesan who's, independently wealthy, and Julia Felix, the businesswoman, have the most freedom of any of the women in the book. Because I did want to reflect that, ancient Roman women had more freedom in many ways than ancient women from ancient Greece. They were much more out and about. They were much more involved in business. They could eat with men. A dinner party would have women and men. So they were much more public facing. So, and in some ways, it's quite interesting because I've just been reading Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and I find it really interesting that he doesn't include Fulvia in his story of Caesar's assassination, even though she would have been, Antony's wife, Fulvia, very kind of involved in that whole kind of political machinations. And there's some senses in which, like, Shakespeare's time was probably more patriarchal and oppressive than in ancient Rome for women. So it's quite, because we think of time being so linear, and obviously our progress now today in the 21st century for women is infinitely superior to the ancient Romans. But it doesn't mean the progress for women has been like, oh, every century it just got better and better and better. There's stuff in the ancient Rome actually that I think is almost more identifiable than many later periods in terms of how it was for women.
Well, I think Christianity was the sort of the cause for a lot of the backsliding, we'll call it, of like women's rights and everything. Because and even Greece is so interesting because most of what we know is based on Athens, and Athens was like particularly oppressive towards women.
Yes.
So I'm always interested in like, what do we not know about the other regions and everything. And yeah, but Rome is so interesting because women did have this extra power. I'm sure I said this last time we spoke, but most of my knowledge of ancient Rome is based on movies and Star's Spartacus series, which is not a great way to base your history, but it's what I've got. But it's just generally interesting to me the way that women seem to hold this power, and I guess the way that they both chose and did not choose to like utilize their sexuality to also gain more power and everything. I mean, it's dark that is sort of their best option, but it is interesting to look at the ways that women could sort of harness their own sexuality to get themselves into a better situation in life.
I mean, that's definitely one of the sort of major roots for women from that period. And it was, for every success story, there would have been so many, many hundreds of women who died in poverty, who tried that route, whose ability to earn lasted such a brief period, and they didn't get that stability. But it was a route, and some women did manage it. And I actually find it quite interesting. I really like the playwright Terence, and he writes quite sympathetically, or at least ambiguously, about courtesans. This notion that they have to be very manipulative, they have to be very ruthless, because if you were a nice sweetie pie, you're not going to make the money, and then you're going to be poor and you're going to die poor and young. Whereas what you need is to just get the cash that you can. So that was, Amara remains, and I found it quite interesting. Some people who've read the book who were like, oh, she's not so likable, she's so obsessed with money. But this is a reflection on the sort of negative stereotype of courtesans and sex workers of the time. But it's also, she has to be avaricious. This is the only way she's going to survive is money. So yeah, her kind of obsession with money, and she's obviously got a lot of trauma from what happened in the wolf den. And one of the things that makes her feel safe is counting her money, is looking at what she's amassed. This is her sense of security, and that is very much rooted in sort of the life of courtesans at the time.
Yeah, she feels pragmatic to me. Like, she just recognizes that is the only way out. But I also think it's interesting the ways in which other characters interact with her obsession with money, and the way she feels that is her only way out. She does have these people kind of pushing against it in different ways to sort of make her realize she's like that, not necessarily suggest that it is that she should be different, but sort of just kind of put it in her face a little bit that, like, this is what you have become. At the same time, I mean, it seems valid to become that way once you found the one thing that got you out of such a life, to just hold on to it for dear life.
And also, one of the sort of main characters in this book is Dido, even though she's dead. And I know some people might be slightly surprised by some of the risks and decisions that Amara takes in this book, but really she takes them in the context of grief. She is driven by grief in this book. It's a huge motivator for her in this sort of highly risky relationship that she undertakes, is because she's lost the person she loved best. And so I think this is also the reason why she clings to other things like money or other relationships to give her that sense of stability and love that she had through Dido, because she lost her best friend under really traumatic circumstances. And that felt important to me as well, actually, that I do find sometimes when you read trilogies or books in a series, a character dies in one book and then it's like they didn't exist when you read the second book, or they're referred to maybe once or twice. I mean, Amara is constantly thinking about Dido, and reflecting on her and missing her and behaving. Some of the decisions she makes in Golden Door, I don't think she would have made if Dido had lived. Would she have felt the need to form a close romantic connection with a man if she'd had her best friend? Maybe not. Who knows? So that was something that I was kind of looking at as well, the relationships that people made in the ancient world. I think, particularly when they'd been enslaved, a lot of the times their kind of found family was more important than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense. You would kind of develop the most intense of connections with the people who are experiencing the same thing for you. And then when your life is full of trauma, having to hold on to that moment as well, and just sort of build your life around making up for it, or just sort of existing around that kind of trauma. I was really, of course, because I'm a mythology person, but I just love the opening of sort of the reminder of Dido, with the wall painting and the choice of Diana and Actaeon as the sort of, I was sort of trying to picture how it would be, and I'm curious, what were your thoughts around choosing that myth?
So the Diana and Actaeon myth is really, for me, that represents Amara and Felix. Because it's what he says to her in the wolf den, that when he saw her in the slave market, he thought of Diana because she's naked, which is what you see as a sign of vulnerability. But I mean, obviously Felix doesn't describe it in this detail, but he says, you looked as if you would tear apart any man who dared to see you naked. Because in the myth of Actaeon, the goddess Diana, Actaeon sees her naked, bathing, and so she turns him into a stag, and he's torn apart by his own hounds. So Felix recognizes in Amara this sort of really violent desire for vengeance and to assert herself and to be powerful. And at the end of the wolf den, she sends him as a Saturnalia gift, a statuette of Diana, which is kind of her, I don't want to swear, but up yours type thing, that she's yes, her fuck you moment. She's now she's a freed woman. So she's closer to being Diana. So although it's a homage to Dido by painting Diana as Dido on the walls of the garden, overseeing kind of the vengeance against Actaeon, this is kind of a reminder of who Amara really is and what she wants. But it was also based on very real frescoes from gardens in Pompeii. So it's based on a couple of, there's the House of the Beast Hunt and the House of the Say, who've got these, extraordinary, particularly the Casa de Say, extraordinary hunting scenes, quite violent hunting scenes across a garden. So that was how I visualized it, was both kind of the relevance of the myth to Amara and Felix, but also, some of the scenes that you actually see in Pompeii of these extraordinary kind of wild animal hunts on the wall of the gardens.
The scenes in Pompeii are just so unbelievable. I got a big book that I found at a used bookstore, and I just want to pore over it all the time. Just
beautiful.
Yeah, it's just incredible. One of my favorites, completely separate from any of this, but is the one where Dionysus is dressed up as grapes.
Yes, it's so bizarre, isn't it? That's so true, that some of the stuff in Pompeii that survived is just so peculiar. I mean, for me, it was the cock lamps. Just, I could not believe, like, these giant penises with these little horrible little guys attached, that people had these as lamps. Like, so gross. But yeah, and so alien. But you were much more classy and went for Dionysus dressed in grapes. I was straight in there with the cock lamps. Sorry.
No, I mean, you're the ancient world generally, the obsession with just penises on everything is
Yeah.
amazing to me. I was discussing the Great Dionysia with a guest recently, and it's really, I mean, satyr plays specifically, but even just like the opening procession that they would do to introduce the big, the tragedy festival, that now we look back at these Greek tragedies as these, masterpieces of art, and they are, but they existed at a festival that was just like people waving dicks on sticks all around town.
Like a hen party, but worse. Yeah.
Truly, yeah. And so I mean, we have all those stories from ancient Athens, like 500, 600 years before, and then the fact that it all exists in Pompeii as well. Like, I do appreciate the way the love of just cock representation just spanned the whole of the Mediterranean, seemingly, or at least the northern part.
Yeah, there's definitely a big penis obsession going on. And actually, yeah, and a lot of this sexual art as well. And there's been that discovery quite recently in Pompeii of that chariot, where it's actually just outside of Pompeii, a big villa. And that's got these medallions of like quite violent sexual scenes going on. And I put that in the book as well. I had it, we don't really know what that chariot was for. It might have been for religious festivals. It might have been for high class weddings. It would have been, pretty extraordinary, impressive sort of scarlet chariot. But I included it in the House of the Golden Door as a prop that's used for the floralia because of these sort of very sexualized medallions. So yeah, I found it, the thing is, we don't know really how a lot of these things were used for sure. Obviously, there are much greater experts than me who've made, great sort of guesses as to what it could be. But I just thought, well, why not? Why not have it in the floralia? It's not impossible.
But I think that's what fiction is so good for. And I'm sort of similar in the book that I may or may not ever finish, but of just trying to, like, I have such a long list of little references, little like tiny things I have found over the years that I want to put in different places as just like
Yes.
odes. Yeah, to everything we do and don't know, but the things we have, whether we know what they mean or not. But and I mean, mythology is so similar, of just fragmentary pieces of, one person wrote this like really bizarre, completely different take on somebody, and then like 15 other people have written the straightforward myth, and then you got to wonder who this one person off in the distance is, coming up with something totally seemingly nonsensical, but like we don't know, it could be something we're just totally missing out on. And yeah, so I appreciate the use of like whatever little thing you would come across to be able to pluck it into your story is so satisfying.
Yeah, I love all that. I mean, I had to ditch a ton of stuff as well because in the end, like quite a lot of things that we know about Roman daily life, I didn't necessarily put it all in, like, because it can slow it down, and then it's like you're explaining daily life so much. So I did take some liberties and just like cut stuff out too. But yeah, I wanted to put enough in there that people get a real sense of the time and place and the strangeness of it, the way that it's quite alien.
Yeah. Was there anything you had to cut that you're particularly sad to have missed out on, or generally anything that you want to share that you love but had to cut?
Gosh, that's actually probably gonna have to have a real think about that. So I guess just kind of stuff around the objects. There was nothing sort of massive or like loads of detail. I guess the stuff that I cut, like lots of detail about clothing or household gods or like table manners or whatever, that in the end I just thought, oh wow, this is quite a long book anyway. Let's just have them eat. um, without like endless descriptions of foot washing or whatever. Yeah, so there's nothing that I sort of cut out that I just thought, oh, I'm really gutted that I left that out. It's quite a long book. I was quite greedy.
Yeah, I appreciate it's interesting because like the Wolf Den looks so thick on in print, and I have the obviously the advanced copy of The House with the Golden Door, and it's so like succinct it looks like, and then you going through and you're like, no, there's a lot of pages in here, and in a good way. But I read the Wolf Den last year. I read it on my iPad, and so it didn't register to me how long it was, which is good. That means that I was just like reading it and enjoying it. But then I got to the end, I was like, oh yeah, that was quite a long book. Like you actually look at it compared to others, I'm like, oh no, there's quite a few hundred pages in that. But they're well used, because if you don't stare at a book and thinking like, oh my god, how am I only halfway, then that's certainly a good sign.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope the pages turn quite quickly.
Absolutely. Just like the last one, I'm discovering more and more about what I now know is ADHD, and not that I am lazy. But I have to work on a deadline. So which means like I think with Wolf Den I read it like in one day before I talked to you. And in this one
Wow.
this one I gave myself 4 days. So
That's impressive though.
but even still, I'm like, it's one of those things and I'm not just trying to just throw compliments at you, but I also think it's nice. But I really just like, I read it so easily, and I was just like, okay, I have to get through it. And I'm like, oh, this is not a chore at all. I actually gave myself like 5 hours this morning to finish it, and I finished it like 2 hours earlier than I planned, and I was very I was impressed.
Oh, that's really nice to know.
I just generally very much appreciate these books. I do think it is that thing that I need, that I don't realize I needed until I'm in these ones of, I live too much in mythology, but I still want the ancient world. So I just very much appreciate an if really detailed ancient world book that doesn't have me thinking about my day, quote unquote, day job like quite so much.
Yeah, and it is, it plays on a lot of the sort of, it's not like a retelling by any stretch of the imagination whatsoever, but like the sort of Diana and Actaeon thing, it plays on a lot of the kind of ideas of power struggle, of sex, of betrayal, all these kind of things that are in the myths. I put the drama in there as well for the books. And yeah, and just as we were saying earlier, in the myths, you've got like the enslaved women kind of wafting around, but they don't have anything to say really for themselves. So yeah, again, it's kind of looking at the world of the myths in a slightly different way.
Yeah, just giving women voices and power in a way that, I mean, I think that's what's great about a lot of like explicitly mythological retellings these days. But I also think it's equally important in books about just the ancient world. It just, this idea that just because it was a certain way for women doesn't mean that they didn't have their own, inner thoughts and feelings and actions,
Yes.
right? We don't see what they were doing and what they were thinking, but that doesn't mean they weren't doing and thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel really passionately about this. And just like with, there is an acknowledgement, oh, yeah, enslaved people wouldn't have been happy with their lot. Women wouldn't have been happy with their lot either. Some women, of course, would, people do internalize negative views of themselves. And, some people would have been very happily married and happily been mothers and embraced the very traditional role, of course, if they were lucky enough to be married to somebody nice. But, lots of women who were incredibly intelligent and ambitious, or just deeply dissatisfied with their lives, would have resented a lot of this stuff, and the sort of lust for power in the elite is just as strong with the women as the men. um, you know, so why wouldn't it have been lower down the social scale as well? And that's something that I find quite heartening with some of the evidence in Pompeii, when like Terentius Neo and his wife, they were, I think, bakers, but like the fresco of them is very famous. They're kind of painted as equals, holding the tools of, she's like holding like implements of literacy, and they look like a team, so you feel like, oh, and yeah, and women like Julia Felix, successful businesswomen as well. So I guess where the Wolf Den really did look at just how crappy it could be for women, things have improved with the House of the Golden Door. We get a bit more of a sense of how women could create more space for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's just so important to look at those stories and real, quote unquote real. Like by that I just mean history, not mythology.
Yeah.
But yeah, real people in that world navigating that stuff. Because as much as a lot of angry men, typically on the internet, want you to believe that it was just that it's the way it was, and so we don't need to look back critically on it. Like that's utter nonsense. And I think, I mean, it's why I have my podcast. So I'm thrilled when I get to talk to other people who see that same issue of, I think it is so important to look back at these women and what they were doing and how they were, taking up space is such a good phrase that you just used to describe what they were doing, just making space for themselves. Because I mean, it's obviously just as applicable today. We don't live in a equal society for men and women, and so looking at how women have tried to make their place,
In the
2,000 years
past.
ago, is so important as well, and just interesting and like a nice thing to read.
Well, thank you.
Well, I mean, honestly, this has been so much fun. I love that you were good to go on just making it a conversation, and
Oh yeah, absolutely. Always happy to chat with you. It's really cool.
I feel the same. This has just been so fascinating. Thank you so much. I just enjoy reading your books, and I enjoy talking to you. So thank you for coming back on the show.
Honestly, Liv, it's such a joy to come on the show. I love the podcast. I love chatting to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It means a lot as well that people continue to want to come back and chat with me and just kind of hang out and talk about ancient stuff. So thank you. Thank you, nerds. As always, I really love talking with Elodie and learning more about ancient Pompeii every time. It's such a fascinating look into the ancient world that we just don't have elsewhere. That volcano gave us so much. Even if, it was probably pretty shitty for the people who lived and died in Pompeii. But thanks to it, we have the mosaic of Dionysus dressed in grapes. And I mean in grapes. Standing near a way too big snake and a way too small leopard. Google it. It is a work of absolutely bizarre and brilliant art. Plus, cock lamps. Cock lamps everywhere. Actually, penises literally everywhere. Pompeii is a wealth of penises. And on that note, please check out Elodie's 2 books, The Wolf Den and The House with the Golden Door. Both are now available in North America and in the UK. And probably elsewhere too. I'm not entirely sure, but definitely those 2 English markets. You can also follow Elodie on Twitter and Instagram. I have linked to both of those in the episode's description. And stay tuned for the 3rd book in her series. I know I am waiting not so patiently. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things, from running the YouTube to creating promotional images and videos to editing and research. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by Acast. Thank you all. You're the best. I am Liv, and I love this shit.